this suggests that the instructor explanation alone does not give all the students an equal chance. That it's the combination of those two protocols, allowing them to discuss and think and work on ideas, and then hearing a confirmation, which might allow them to maybe click to the right thinking if they didn't quite have it before. And so the obvious thing that's not here is what do the students look like if they only have peer discussion? And I didn't do that.
But also you may be picking up, like if you wanted to do a multiple intelligences argument, that you're kind of picking up 15% with the peer instruction and the others with the instructor.
Yeah.
Do you have a sort of an explanation to yourself about why in this population, after the instructor explanation, the students who got question number 1 right are getting it wrong?
Are not.
You called it laziness. That's a hypothesis. Any other hypotheses? I mean, is it a feature of the population of students? Is it about, say, guessing?
Unfortunately, I don't know, certainly, because I haven't asked that question, seriously enough of the students to try to get some feedback on why they might be falling down.
If everybody guesses, then you get
Not
about 50% correct, and then the next question you get about 50% incorrect.
Right. So this is better than guessing. They're not just guessing.
Right.
But
maybe there's more guessing going on here than in the majors population.
Right. My other guess besides laziness would be depth of understanding is not as good as it is for the majors. So they figure this question out. It kind of makes sense to them. But then they're not as good at transferring the knowledge to the next question. And it's a very similar question, but it's not the same exact question. Something might be throwing them for a loop. They're very bad at reading questions. These students are. They have a really hard time interpreting what I'm trying to ask.
Just a little. No.
Or you could cheese surface level stuff. It very well could be, like you said, that's a conceptual
I think that they are achieving some conceptual understanding, but it's not as deep as the majors. And that could explain why we don't get to 90% or 95% when we did with the majors. Okay, so I think peer discussion is still valuable. I think this data suggests that it is. And because of how different this was, I am not going to tell you any more about this series of questions. I didn't want to lump this series that didn't have any peer discussion with the series of questions that did have peer discussion because they're different. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the retention study now, but it's not going to include these 9 questions. It's going to go back to the 14 that I originally showed you.
Hey, Jenny, how much overlap is there between these question series and the ones that tend to use? Were you, you're comparing these students to the major students. I'm just wondering, were the question series actually the same?
No. Some of the questions were the same, but many of them were different. It might have been useful to use some of those questions, and I haven't actually gone back to look at all of them and see how many overlap. Some of them definitely do overlap, but we didn't design it to take the exact questions. Sometimes, so because the majors course goes into more detail on certain topics, some of their series of questions just weren't appropriate for my students. So they are. No, it's a good question. Yeah.
So you may be talking about this, but genetics is the odd man in a biology curriculum because it's essentially formal logic in the way most people teach it. Rather, you can do genetics without knowing anything about genes, and so, essentially, you can learn the rules. And so the question is, you haven't looked at, and that actually makes it so that it is in your favor, and that it is easy to generate an isomorphous question because they're all logically the same structure, right? Which is different from, say, cell or molecular biology, which you don't have the same kind of rigid rules. Have you thought about how this transfers into? Because many people, they like genetics, they go to cell biology and their brain explodes, right? And so.
Part of that, I think, is because of the way cell biology is taught.
But let's back off from personality for a minute and think about just the way the discipline is structured, because genetics is really just completely different from the rest of MCDB.
So I would argue that genetics is more like physics than most of the other types of classes, because you can ask these kinds of logical, conceptual questions, problem-solving types of questions.
But your questions are relatively simple, right? They're sort of Mendelian. They're
not all
not-
of them. I mean, we don't only talk about Mendelian genetics, we also talk about transcription and translation.
No, but you don't talk about alleles with variable penetrance and expressivity.
Well, we actually do, but I don't emphasize
You don't question
that.
them.
So I didn't have a question on penetrance or expressivity in this particular series, but I did have one on multiple alleles and how that might affect phenotype. I had a question series on
Right.
codominance.
Okay.
So there are some more sophisticated questions in there. They're not all the total baseline.
But you don't get into hardcore,
No.
blow your brains out genetics.
No, it's really not. I would say no, because these are non-science majors. I mean, this is
No, but
they're
in the
taking
other
this-
class, do they? So
in
if
the
you
other
were to
class,
argue,
they do, I think, get into some of those.
do they do
hardcore.
genetic background effects on allele?
Relevant to the clicker thing.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering whether the reason that you get some of these results is that the course is actually. So I'm worried. I mean, I worry about whether the questions are asked are essentially semi-trivial,
I see.
which they may have already learned in, say, a high school genetics.
Yeah.
If standard Mendelian genetics
I
is
don't-
relatively straightforward.
Right, but if they were so easy, if they were so trivial,
No,
then
so I
we
was
should
just
have
curious.
a higher percent
Right.
correct on Q1. So.
But you could be reminding them of the
Yes,
answer,
yes,
and
yes.
then they.
We could be, some of the topics are certainly review for students who had advanced biology courses in high school.
So this will be. I just can't wait
No,
to the
it's
next
okay.
study when you look at, say, advanced. Well, because really, I mean, when you know the field, right? There's
Yeah.
basic Mendelian genetics, which is
Yeah.
relatively straight up, and then there's like real human genetics, which is not
Much more
relatively straight up.
complicated, sure.
And
Well,
so
Well, Mike, I
That'd be
may
cool.
I may address some of these questions in developmental biology, which is the other course that I teach, which is for
Right,
seniors.
right.
It's the last course they take that's required, and it's a very much higher level course.
well, it's a completely
More
different.
data.
Completely different from
Right.
genetics, although we do some developmental genetics
Right.
in that class. But that might be an interesting comparison.
That'd be cool.
It may be completely different how they react to those questions, and it may be a lot harder to write those questions as well. But okay, so let me tell you about retention before I run out of time. So here are the two questions that, or here's the one question really that I wanted to ask. And I did follow it up with isomorphic questions on the exam, so I'll tell you about that too. But the basic idea was, can the students remember these concepts well enough to apply them to another isomorphic question a couple days later? It's the next class period, sometimes it's 2 class periods later, depending on the situation of the class, but it doesn't span an exam at any time. So presumably the students aren't studying the material in between Q2 and Q3, but we don't know for sure that that's true. They might be reviewing it. We can't say that for sure. So this is just exactly what I told you before. Q1, Q1AD, with the instructor explanation. Q2, again, more instructor explanation. Time passes, and I start the next class period by saying, here's a review question from last time. Everybody answer individually, see if you guys remember what we talked about last time. So I introduce it as a review question before anything else is discussed that day. So my basic thought about this was if they are not retaining anything, then they should go back to their original performance on Q1, so which was about 53%. And so we hope that they don't go back to that number.